Hello everyone, and welcome back to the show. My name is Jacob Gorgi, and today I am with His Eminence, Anba Angaelos, Archbishop of London. How are you today, Sayedna?
Well, thank you, Joe. Very good to be with you.
Thank you. So let's start from the beginning. Now, I know your immigration path was Egypt to Australia, and then back to Egypt as a monk, and then eventually to London. So really, I want to focus on becoming a monk, because it's a huge life change. So what was that path to monasticism like?
Well, I mean, it's really interesting. I migrated with my family to Australia when I was 5. So I grew up there, went to school, university, served in church, had my circle of friends. Very normal, I suppose you would say, life. But then I started to feel the calling, and that's when I accepted it. I discussed it with my confession father, my spiritual guide, took steps to doing something about it. But of course, like many things, when you look at matters in retrospect, you feel things building up in a very different way. And you understand that God was putting many things in play that you may not even be aware of. So that was my path, and I then decided that I would go to Egypt and see where that calling led me. I traveled to Egypt. I entered the monastery in 1990, served as secretary, and I was the disciple really of the late Pope Shenouda for 6 years. 1993 I was ordained a priest, because in the monastery some monks are ordained as priests so that the function of the monastery can continue. And at the end of 1995, so 6 years later, I was sent to England. I served there for 4 years as a monk priest in a parish by myself that I established. And then 1999 went back to Egypt, was consecrated a bishop, and then served as a general bishop until 2017, when His Holiness Pope Tawadros II visited London and decided that London would be better served if it was an independent diocese. And that's when I was enthroned as Bishop of London.
So then, those early days in London, because the show, a lot of it's focused on kind of immigration and documenting that experience. So what were those early days in London like? I mean, obviously besides, I'm sure it was a smaller population, but kind of growing a diocese into what it was, what it is today. What was that like, and kind of what were the struggles you had to deal with doing that?
So London was by no means new. London, people have been in London since the 60s, but the actual bulk of presence started in the 70s. So we've just celebrated 50 years since the first service was conducted in London. So when I went, it had been running since the 70s. I was there in middle of the 90s. So a service was established. There were parishes there, community. The United Kingdom is not a huge Coptic community. It's still very difficult to get into the UK. Most of our community there historically have been medics, so they went to the United Kingdom to get their membership in the Royal Colleges of Medicine, and then they settled, and then over time their children grew up and the community grew. It was a wonderful community. It's very much home now. I've been there for almost 30 years. And having been there for so long, and starting as a monk priest and then becoming a general bishop, then a diocesan bishop, it means that it's been quite an organic transition. And it means that I know people, they know me, we've served together for a while. I am now starting to baptize children of children I baptized.
Oh.
So it's beautiful to see, seeing people who are, in single-digit ages, 5, 6, 7, and now in their mid-30s, people who are in a very different stage of life at the moment. And rather than just being served, they're also now serving and contributing, and wonderful. So no, it has been so far a wonderful journey.
Yeah. Which leads me on to, I was just corrected earlier, your OBE, which is extremely prestigious. I'm just kind of curious, forgive this if this is a little ignorant, but how did that happen? Like, it was very, I know you usually get selected for this, from what I understand, correct? Or is it?
So it's not prestigious. I mean, I think prestigious is the wrong term. It's not about prestige. It is a recognition of work done, and so there are different levels of awards that are given. I received this from the late Queen. It was in 2015, I think, and it was particularly to do with work for international religious freedom, which is something it's a niche I've sort of worked on. Having been, as I said, for almost 30 years, we went through some very difficult times of El Kosh in Egypt and then Maspero, and seeing Coptic Christians attacked. And of course, back then, we would speak about the Coptic Christians and how they were persecuted in Egypt. And then when things started to change in the Middle East, and the uprising started, and the demographics started to shift, and people started to move, we saw a lot of persecution of Christians, whether it be in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria. And so we started to broaden out, rather than just speaking about Coptic Christians in Egypt, it was about Christians in the Middle East. And then you see other communities also start to struggle, other communities, religious communities, whether we agree with them or not. It's important for us to recognize that God creates us with an inherent right to choose our own path, and He respects that. He doesn't like it sometimes, but He respects it, and the indication is that, well, we are able to reject Him, and He doesn't force us not to. So I think as a Christian, I felt that using my heritage and the experience of my church, and knowing what it meant to be persecuted, meant that we really couldn't be quiet when other people were persecuted for their religion or belief. And so started doing some work with a variety of communities, whether it was the Baha'is in Iran, or the Yazidis in Iraq, or the Rohingya, or the Uyghurs, or a lot of different faith communities, religious communities. And I suppose that was recognized, and we're very blessed that as a church, the Coptic Orthodox Church is probably the only church in the United Kingdom doing this kind of work. And we have a legitimacy and a believability because it's something we have gone through and we understand. We're not talking about something we don't understand. We're not talking about issues that are hypothetical. We've gone through it. And by God's grace, we've survived it, and we continue to survive it. And so I think that was the impetus for my work. And so the OBE came as a result of that.
I see. So going back to something you mentioned earlier, your discipleship with Pope Shenouda. I'll be very honest, I have a million questions. Due in part because, my generation, we were old enough to know and recognize that he's the Pope. But we were too young to really understand why, our parents, venerated him. And as I'm getting older, especially even doing this show, I'm beginning to understand why. But I'm curious, what was he like, being a disciple, for him? What was it like?
So I think we're very blessed in our church. When you think back to, the founder of our church, St. Mark, going through, to great fathers like Saint Athanasius, who was our 20th Pope, going through to, the now canonized saint, Pope Kyrillos VI, and then the late Pope Shenouda, and now he's having his Pope Tawadros. God has blessed us with wonderful fathers who were very suited to the era they were in. And that's just his providence, and that's his wisdom. And that's why he, he entrusts the church to shepherds who will look after it in the right way at the right time. And you have many people who served with the late Pope Kyrillos who will tell you wonderful stories about his saintliness and his power and his sense of fatherhood. Likewise, when I served with the late Pope Shenouda, I was 22 when I entered the monastery, so very young.
It's my age, actually. Wow.
Yeah. So imagine, at that age, I had left everything, left Australia, left my family, left my work, and I was at that time the first person in the church to have been brought up abroad and to go and join the monastery in Egypt. So I think His Holiness then took me under his wing, and he really was very much a father to me. He was a mentor. It wasn't just the service I was doing. He was shaping. He was mentoring me. He was guiding me, and that was really special. And he did it in a variety of ways. So I would learn from him, quite directly when he said, "Listen, do things this way." And I would learn from him by seeing how he did certain things and how he dealt with certain situations. And I would learn by just seeing what was going on around me. When you're serving with the Pope, everything comes on your doorstep. And quite often they are problematic things, they're difficult things. And so you also learn, A, what not to do, and B, how to deal with situations. So it was wonderful. And he was by nature a mentor, a teacher. He always has been. Ever since he was teaching in the school for monks, and then he served, as bishop for Christian education, and then as Pope, he always loved to teach and mentor, and that's what I felt. I remember when I was consecrated a bishop, and I'd spent that month in Egypt, 2 weeks before and 2 weeks after. So I'd sat with His Holiness the day before I left, and I said to him, "Your Holiness, it's been such a blessing serving with you, and I've learned a lot, and you've been a wonderful teacher." And he turned to me and said, "Yes, but you wanted to learn." And so I think he could recognize that, and he recognized that people had the potential to learn, that he would then give of himself and teach. Because what you see sometimes, especially in our world today, is some people like to hold on to things to themselves. You don't want to share information, you don't want to share experience. Whereas he, as a father, as a mentor, really wanted to share and to shape.
So what was one lesson that he taught you that to this day still resonates? So I guess you could almost say the greatest lesson Pope Shenouda taught you.
I've told this story many times. Of one day I had the monk who was looking after the residents come to me and say, "His Holiness wants you." So got into his car, went out, and we went into an orchard. It was a lemon orchard. And I found the Pope sitting on the ground with 2 pairs of pruning scissors that you use to prune trees. Handed one to me and said, "I want to teach you how to prune a tree." Okay, not really what I had in mind, but fine. I don't know why I would need to learn how to prune a tree. We had people look after the orchards, we had people look after the farms. Why would I need to learn how to prune a tree? So, but, A, I trusted it, and B, I was spending literally one-on-one time with the Pope. Nobody around, in the middle of the desert, middle of an orchard, pruning trees. And so he started to direct me and say, trees need to grow upwards, so when you see intertwined or tangled branches, you untangle them. If you find something that is starting to droop down, you snip it so it goes back up. If you see little shoots that are taking nourishment from the tree. You prune them so they don't take. And it was I'd never done it before. It was an education. And then at the end he said, pruning a tree is like guiding and discipling your spiritual children. This is what you need to learn. And it was then that the penny dropped, and I understood what he was talking about. And so since then, that lesson really stayed in my mind. So for years after that, when I just wanted to think, I'd grab my pruning scissors and go out and prune the tree. And I've realized that's what he was doing with me. He would snip and direct and support, and that's what I hope that I'm doing with people around me. So that was a very important lesson that, honestly, it was 34 years ago, but it feels like it was yesterday.
So this kind of leads me on to my last question. Now, typically at the end of these interviews, I always like to ask an outlook question so that people looking back have some advice. And generally, I try to keep them broad, but also within the theme of the episode, which this kind of questions fall into, so it works out. But what advice would you give to those who are newly ordained? That's been kind of the theme of today and kind of the theme of this weekend if you're in Chicago. But what advice would you give, especially in those early stages when you're trying to, I don't want to say figure out your ministry, but we're trying to find that guidance? What advice would you give?
I mean, there's so much that can be said, but if I'm going to sort of distill it into a couple of points, the first thing is we need to understand our own humanity and the limited nature of our ability. Unfortunately, in the church, we often have a view of and give the impression to clergymen that they know everything, and they can do everything, and they can advise on everything, and they can decide on everything, and we can't. So have an understanding of the limited nature of our own experience and our own knowledge, and to lean on others. I definitely surround myself with very good people, and I always say that for me to do better, I've got to surround myself with people who are better than me in every aspect that I need support with. So I think that was the first thing, to understand that we don't need to know everything, but we need to be able to call on the right people who know a variety of things, so then we can be advised, or we can put them into the picture and get them to resolve it. The second thing is, there is an incredible tension between acting quickly and taking your time. And so it's being able to discern which situation needs which approach. Because sometimes if you are too quiet and too reflective, things get out of hand, damage is caused, it's difficult to repair. And sometimes if you're too quick, then things are not well enough planned, not thought through well enough, and deficient. And so I think with time comes the experience of discerning when you need to stop and reflect. And although everyone is pushing you to make a decision, you've got to say, no, not yet. I'm not ready. You're not ready. The situation is not ready. And at other times, to know when I have to act briskly and briefly and quickly, and take a decisive step. And I suppose the third thing I would advise is to remember that we are merely conduits of God's love, and He utilizes us for the service of His church and for the glory of His name. As St. Paul says, not I who live, but Christ who lives in me. As our Lord himself says that, the harvest is great, labourers are few, and he tells us that we are going into a harvest that is not ours, for he is the Lord of the harvest. And so to understand that it's his ministry, it's his flock, it's his field, and we need to be both obedient to his direction, but also, I would say, humble enough to accept that direction when it comes, and to wait for him to work through us.
Right. Well, all the questions I have. Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you, Sayedna, for coming. I really do appreciate it. I know we kind of scrambled to do this one, so thank you. I really do appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, so much for watching. God bless, and good night.